At an elegant elite event, a powerful businessman decided to humiliate and expel his own wife before dozens of witnesses, believing she was just someone else under his control. What he didn't know was that this silent woman hid an identity capable of turning the game and destroying everything he had built. While everyone watched the scandal unfold, an unexpected gesture and a shocking revelation began to expose secrets that none of them imagined. In a few minutes, the man who believed he commanded everything realized he had committed the greatest mistake of his life, and that regret would come too late. Before discovering how this surprising story changed everyone's destiny that night, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and prepare yourself for a report that proves that underestimating someone can cost very dearly. The Club Fasano in the heart of Jardins was the type of place where power did not need to announce itself. It was in the texture of the Italian marble that covered the lobby, in the calculated silence of the waiters, in the discreet weight of the invitations printed on cream paper with gold edges. Whoever entered there knew they belonged to a different world, and whoever did not belong simply did not enter. The air conditioning maintained a temperature that never varied, as if discomfort were a condition reserved for inferior environments, and the flowers in the center of each table were changed daily, because slightly wilted flowers were, in that universe, an unacceptable form of carelessness. On that Thursday in October, the crystal glasses sparkled under the amber light of the chandeliers, when Rodrigo Cavalcante crossed the revolving doors with the confidence of someone who believes the world was built to receive him. Tall, in a dark grey suit custom-made on Rua Oscar Freire, hair slightly greying at the temples, he carried with him that particular aura of men accustomed to being the most important in any room they inhabited. Founder of Cavalcante and Associados, one of the largest holdings in the São Paulo financial market, Rodrigo was an expected presence in the circles that decided the future of billions with the same tranquility with which others decided the dinner menu. At his side, Isabella walked with measured steps, her emerald green dress fitted to her body in a way that seemed to have been sewn directly onto her. Her dark hair tied in an elegant bun, the diamond earrings he himself had chosen for her that afternoon, saying they would match the dress better than the ones she had set aside. She had agreed in silence, put hers back in the box, and put on his. It had been like this for 7 years, not just with the earrings. Isabella Fonseca Cavalcante was 36 years old, had a degree in administration from FGV, fluency in 4 languages, and an analytical capacity that few around her truly knew. Rodrigo knew, of course, but he preferred to ignore it with a consistency that, over time, had transformed into a type of silent violence. For him, his wife's intelligence was a useful tool at business dinners, when she could conduct conversations with foreign partners without him needing to resort to interpreters. Other than that, he preferred her to stay within the limits he had carefully defined over the years, like someone who prunes a tree repeatedly until it grows only in the desired direction. The maitre d' received them with a subtle bow and led them to the reserved table in the main wing of the hall. Rodrigo greeted 4 people along the way, 2 of them with pats on the back and 2 with long handshakes that served as hierarchical signaling. Isabella smiled at every stop, said the correct phrases, asked the questions of genuine interest that he had trained her in for years. How is the family? What a pleasure to see you again. I loved what I read about the project. She pronounced them with such naturalness that she no longer knew if they still felt like anything or if they were just conditioned reflexes, like pressing a button and waiting for the light to turn on. When they sat down, he leaned slightly toward her and said, with a voice low enough to seem intimate and firm enough to be an order, "You are going to circulate later with Renata Montero. She is married to Fabio Montero, a new partner I am trying to bring onto the board. I need you to charm her." Isabella nodded, took her water glass and took a small sip. Inside, she was counting the hours. The night had begun at 8, and it was almost 9 when the first high-profile guests began to settle at the adjacent tables. The event was a commemorative dinner for the Instituto Forum Brasil, an association of which Rodrigo was one of the main financiers, which in practice meant he would be applauded at least twice during the night, and have his name mentioned in the opening speech. He liked this with an intensity that Isabella had learned to recognize as something closer to addiction than common vanity. He needed the reverence of others like one needs air, constantly and in increasing doses. At the table, while the sommelier presented the wine options with the deference of one serving priests, Rodrigo immediately engaged in a side conversation with the man to his right, Gustavo Larrañaga, director of a private equity fund based in Pinheiros. Isabella observed them for a moment, noted the rhythm of the conversation, the body language of the two, and looked away to the rest of the room. It was an exercise she had developed over the years, to observe without being seen, to process without reacting, to be present without actually existing in that space. It was then that she saw the bartender. He was behind the sidebar, preparing drinks with precise and economical movements. 40-something, perhaps, broad shoulders, an upright posture that contrasted with the discreet curvature of the other employees, always slightly leaning, as if in permanent anticipation of the desires of others. There was something in the way he moved that didn't completely fit the environment. It wasn't sloppiness, nor inadequacy. It was almost as if he were exactly where he had decided to be, and not where destiny or necessity had placed him. Isabella did not linger in her gaze. Rodrigo noticed these things. The dinner progressed with the expected ritual. Appetizer of scallops with passion fruit reduction and coconut foam. Main course of lamb with an aromatic herb crust and manioc puree. Rodrigo spoke about the third quarter results as if they were exclusively personal achievements, which to some extent they were. But the arrogance in the presentation transformed legitimate merit into an uncomfortable spectacle. Isabella ate slowly, participated in conversations when directly addressed, and felt the accumulated fatigue of 7 years settling on her shoulders with a familiar and at the same time suffocating weight. At a certain point, when Rodrigo was absolutely concentrated on the monologue he was holding with Gustavo about the IPO of a logistics company, she excused herself and headed to the bathroom. On the way back, she passed the sidebar. The bartender was alone for a moment, and when she approached without intending to stop, he placed a glass of water with a slice of lemon on the counter without her asking, without there being any practical reason for the gesture other than attentive observation and a deliberate choice. She looked at him. He looked back at her without discomfort, without exaggerated subservience. He said, with a calm and unceremonious voice, "It looks like you need this more than wine tonight." Isabella stood still for 2 seconds. Then she took the glass, took a long sip, and returned it. "Thank you," she said. It was the most sincere word she had pronounced all night, and perhaps in many nights before this one. When she returned to the table, Rodrigo was finishing a story about a negotiation in Dubai that he had narratively transformed into a strategic victory. She sat down, crossed her hands in her lap, and went back to smiling at the right moments. But something had changed inside her. It wasn't gratitude for the glass of water, although the kindness was real. It was the recognition that a stranger had seen in her, something that her own husband had stopped seeing a long time ago. A human being with real fatigue, with real limits, with an inner life that could not be managed like an item on a meeting agenda. The room continued to spin around itself with its manufactured elegance, and Isabella looked at the flowers in the center of the table, too fresh to be real, and thought that there was something deeply honest in that glass of water, offered by unknown hands on a night when everything around was calculated to impress and never to care. At a certain point in the evening, after the speech by the president of the institute, during which Rodrigo received the expected recognition with the performative humility he had perfected over the years, the room entered a more relaxed phase. The tables dissolved into smaller groups, conversations became looser, and the sidebar became the epicenter of movement. It was the moment Rodrigo was waiting for. Not because he liked to converse lightly, but because it was when true alliances were formed, outside the scrutiny of cameras and formal records. He called Isabella with a discreet gesture, a movement of his chin toward the side where Renata Montero was laughing with 2 other women. Isabella understood immediately. She stood up, adjusted her dress with a natural movement, and walked toward the group with that professional smile that had become a second skin. Renata was a woman of approximately 40 years, with blonde hair and a relaxed manner that seemed genuine, which made her both likable and unpredictable for the purposes Rodrigo had in mind. The two talked for almost 20 minutes. Isabella discovered that Renata had studied in Paris, that she had a daughter who had recently graduated in architecture, and that her husband Fabio had surprised her with a trip to Japan on their 15th wedding anniversary. It was the kind of conversation that Isabella knew how to conduct with genuine skill, not just performatively, because deep down she still had curiosity about people, even if that curiosity rarely had room to grow within the marriage. When she returned to Rodrigo's side, he subtly pulled her by the arm and said in a low voice, "You were taking too long." Isabella felt the pressure of his fingers around her wrist, not violent, but precise like a warning. "I did what you asked," she replied, maintaining a neutral tone. He let her go, turned to the group of men in front of him, and resumed the conversation as if nothing had happened. Isabella stood beside him for a moment, then walked slowly toward the sidebar. She needed distance, she needed air. The hall, with all its grandeur, had become too small. The bartender was finishing an order when she approached. This time she stood still, without pretending to be passing by chance. She asked for a glass of water with ice, and he handed it over without asking unnecessary questions. There was something in his silence that made her less tense than any conversation she had engaged in that night. "You've worked here a long time," she said, not exactly as a question, but as a way to fill the space without demanding a specific answer. He replied, "Long enough to know the place well." There was an ambiguity in that response that she did not explore. She drank the glass calmly, looked briefly at the room and said, "It must be interesting to observe everything from here." The bartender cleaned the counter with a cloth and replied calmly, "When you're on the outside, you see things that those on the inside don't notice." Isabella was silent for an instant. Then she placed the glass on the counter and thanked him again, this time without the haste of the first time. He nodded lightly, and she walked back toward her husband. The night was reaching the part where alcohol had loosened inhibitions enough for conversations to become longer and less cautious. Rodrigo was excited, which would normally be a good sign, but Isabella had learned that his excitement could turn in any direction depending on variables she did not control. A wrong word from someone, a silence interpreted as disrespect, a situation that made him feel less than his self-image. Gustavo mentioned the name of one of Rodrigo's competitors with a casual compliment, something about a recent acquisition that had been smart. It was enough. Isabella saw the change in her husband's face, that subtle tightening around the eyes that she had learned to decipher as a thermometer before the storm. Rodrigo countered with a destructive analysis of the mentioned acquisition, demolishing Gustavo's reasoning with surgical efficiency and transforming the other's compliment into proof of naivety. Gustavo backed away, uncomfortable. Others around looked away. Isabella stood still, looking at the flowers on the central table, waiting for the moment to pass. Then Rodrigo turned to her and said, with that voice that was specific to public situations where he needed to humiliate, without appearing to humiliate, "What do you think, Isabella? Did you read the acquisition report I sent you last week?" She knew it was a trap. If she said yes and agreed with Rodrigo, it would be a victory for him. If she said she hadn't read it, he would expose her before everyone as someone who didn't pay attention to her husband's work. It was a game he played frequently, using her as an instrument for demonstrating power without anyone around, clearly understanding what was happening. She replied calmly, "I read it, and I think there are valid perspectives on both sides depending on the indicators one prioritizes." The answer was exactly the one he did not expect. Rodrigo looked at her for a second with something she recognized as compressed irritation. Then he smiled at the group and said, "See, even she stays on the fence." There was a polite laugh. The moment passed. But Isabella felt that something had accumulated in that speech of his, in the way he had used her before everyone, in the way the word "she" sounded in his mouth, as if she were an object of reference and not a person with a name. 7 years of small accumulations, and this was one more layer deposited over all the others. She needed to leave, not just from the club, but she still didn't know where to. The next hour passed like those hours pass, when the body is present but the mind has already left. Isabella circulated, smiled, responded, greeted, and said goodbye to people whose names she would know for how much longer. There was a specific fatigue that came not from physical work, nor from intellectual effort, but from the incessant maintenance of an emotional performance that no longer had a connection to what she truly felt. Around 11 at night, when the last groups were still at the tables and the bar continued busy, Isabella returned to the sidebar. This time there was no justification to offer herself, no excuse of a casual passing. She simply went there and stood before the bartender who had been the only person that night to see her without an agenda. He was preparing a drink and raised his eyes briefly. She said, without knowing exactly why she said it, "Do you see many nights like this?" He finished the drink, handed it to a waiting waiter and replied, "I see nights. Some are the same. Others have something different in the air." "This one does," she said, more to herself than to him. He did not answer immediately. He dried his hands on the white napkin, looked at her with that direct attention that neither invaded nor retreated, and said, "Sometimes the difference comes from the person who is in the room, not from the room itself." Isabella stood looking at him for 2 seconds before hearing Rodrigo's voice calling her name from afar. With that specific intonation she knew as code for "come immediately." She moved away from the counter without haste but without delay, and as she walked back she felt the bartender's eyes following her exit with something that was not common curiosity. It was attention, and there was an enormous difference between the two things. The following morning, the apartment on Avenida Europa was in silence when Isabella woke up. Rodrigo had left early, as he always did when there was something to resolve before 9, and the silence of the apartment was one of the few privileges she still enjoyed without guilt. It was a silence different from the silence of the club, which was manufactured and full of undercurrents. The morning silence was only hers, and she had learned to inhabit it with care, as if it could last longer if it were not disturbed. She sat on the balcony for almost an hour, with the coffee she had made for herself and the tablet on the table, where she had unopened notifications. It was an unusual October morning in São Paulo, with a clear blue sky and a breeze that was not suffocating. From the balcony, it was possible to see the treetops of the avenue and further back, the still slow movement of the avenue. In those hours, before the weight of the day settled completely, Isabella allowed herself to think with an honesty that rarely had room at other moments. She thought about the bartender, not with romanticism, but with a kind of analytical curiosity that she recognized as part of her own temperament. There was something about him that didn't fit, and this mismatch intrigued her in the same way that out-of-place details in a financial balance sheet would intrigue her. It wasn't his appearance, nor his position, nor the words he had said. It was the quality of his presence, a quiet solidity that didn't need approval to sustain itself. Rodrigo had never had that. Rodrigo needed the approval of everyone around as a condition of functioning, and when he didn't get it, he demanded it from whoever was closest. In the early years, Isabella had tried to understand this mechanism with compassion, attributing it to market pressures, the competitive personality of the sector, the rigid family model he had inherited from his father. But there is a point where understanding ceases to be a virtue and becomes silent complicity with what is done to you, and she had crossed that line without knowing exactly when. The phone vibrated. It was a message from Renata Monteiro, who had gotten the number through Fabio. It said it had been great talking the night before and that she would like to have coffee someday. Isabella responded with a genuine smile that Renata could not see and left the message open. There was something in Renata that seemed real, and real things were too scarce to be handled carelessly. Later morning, Isabella went to the office she maintained discreetly in a building in Villa Olympia. Rodrigo knew of the existence of that office in the same way he knew vaguely that she had some of her own activities related to the management of a family estate she had inherited from her parents. He had never asked for details because he always assumed they were modest resources, an upper-middle-class inheritance that did not deserve his strategic attention. This assumption was, of the many assumptions he had accumulated about his wife, the most convenient for her. The office was spacious, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a team of 12 people who worked with absolute discretion. The sign on the door said only Fonseca Participações, a name that evoked nothing for those passing through the corridor. For those who understood the market more deeply, the name Fonseca carried weight, but in a specific sector, technology and digital infrastructure, where Isabella had built over 12 years a conglomerate that now moved figures, Rodrigo would never imagine associating with the wife who chose earrings for his dinners. She had built all of this in parallel with the marriage, not as an escape strategy, but as a natural extension of who she was before Rodrigo and during Rodrigo, in a part of herself that he had never colonized because he had never truly been interested in it. Isabella Fonseca, the billionaire CEO, had existed longer than Isabella Cavalcante, the decorative wife. But the two had coexisted in silence for 7 years, and that silence had extracted an increasing price. That morning she gathered her legal team and asked for an update on the separation of assets she had discreetly initiated 6 months earlier. Her lead lawyer, Daniel Sartori, presented a full report. Everything was prepared. Only the final decision was missing. Isabella listened to the entire report without interruptions, asked 3 technical questions, received the answers, and asked for 1 more week. Daniel knew her well enough not to press. He knew by her tone that that week would be different from the previous ones. What she had not told Daniel nor anyone was that there was someone besides herself who was observing the marriage with growing concern. For weeks, her older brother, Enrique Fonseca, had been insisting on talking about what he called the situation with Rodrigo. Enrique was reserved by nature, the type who only said something when he had exhausted all reasons to remain silent. The fact that he was insisting meant he had reached that point. On the afternoon of that day, she called him. Enrique answered on the 2nd ring as if he were waiting. They talked for 40 minutes, and at the end of the conversation he said, "Isa, I need to see what is happening up close. I don't trust words alone. Let me take care of this." She knew her brother well enough to know that when he said he would take care of it, he had already planned every detail. And for some reason she couldn't completely name, knowing he was close made her feel something she hadn't felt easily for a long time. Security. That night, when Rodrigo arrived home and commented on a second dinner at the club the following week, Isabella nodded with her usual expression. But inside her was a different calm, not the calm of exhaustion, nor the calm of resignation. It was the calm of someone who already knows that something is about to change, and that this time the change will not come from the outside. It will come from within. In the following 3 days, Isabella lived her routine as she always had, but with a new layer of awareness about every detail. Rodrigo would arrive late, talk about business, give orders disguised as preferences, and judge with a naturalness that revealed how much he had stopped caring about disguising it. On one of the nights, he commented that she had gained weight slightly, using the tone of someone making an objective observation. On another, he cancelled an appointment she had made with old friends without asking, merely informing her that they would have visitors that weekend. Isabella recorded each of these moments with the analytical coldness that was part of her professional nature. Not out of bitterness, but because she had reached a point where she needed to see things with absolute clarity, without the fog of residual hope that had kept her in that marriage for too long. Every small veiled aggression was a data point, and the data accumulated told a story that no longer had any ambiguity. It was on a Friday afternoon that Enrique called her back, with a voice she recognized as his voice when he had a concrete plan. He had obtained discreet access to the club as a temporary member through a mutual partner. He would be present at the next dinner, invisible to Rodrigo, visible only to her, if she knew where to look. He said he wanted to observe, just observe, before any decision. Isabella wanted to say he didn't need to do that, but she didn't say it because she knew he needed to, in the same way she needed to know he would be there. The second dinner at the club happened on a Tuesday, 6 days after the first. This time the event was a private reception, organized by Rodrigo himself, for a group of international investors who were evaluating the possibility of participating in an infrastructure fund he intended to launch early the following year. The selection of guests had been made with surgical precision, only people whose capital or influence directly served his purposes. Isabella had arrived prepared in the way she had learned to prepare for occasions when she would be most used. A classic cut black dress, discreet high heels, simple jewelry that would not compete with her husband's need for attention. She had done this so automatically that she only realized how much she had conditioned herself to erase herself when she looked at herself in the mirror before leaving the apartment and did not recognize for a moment the woman standing there. At the club, the foreign guests were received with the calculated hospitality that Rodrigo had transformed into a system. Isabella was presented as the wife, with an occasional addition that she had a degree in administration and spoke several languages, a detail that served to make her more useful than decorative, without implying sharing the spotlight with her. She greeted each one in their language, asked intelligent questions about their respective countries of origin, and saw in their eyes the surprise that was always present in these situations, the surprise of finding substance where they expected only image. Rodrigo noticed these reactions and used them as a reflection of himself, as if his wife's competence were an attribute he had chosen and therefore possessed. It was a form of appropriation she had observed without being able to name for years, and which she now recognized with a clarity that hurt differently from the old pain. It was at a certain point during the reception, when the guests were scattered in small groups, that she saw him. Henrique was behind the sidebar, in the club uniform and with the same precise movements she had observed 6 days earlier. There was something almost unreal about seeing her brother in that position, he who was one of the most respected investors in the technology sector in the country, with operations on 3 continents and a portfolio that rivaled international sovereign wealth funds. But Henrique was like that. When he decided to do something, he did it completely, without half measures, without delegating what he needed to see with his own eyes. Isabella looked away immediately. She couldn't let any reaction reveal what she knew. Rodrigo was observant when he wanted to be, especially in environments where control was essential to him. The night advanced with the tension that comes not from noise, but from many things contained at the same time. Rodrigo was in top form, alternating between calculated charm with the foreign investors and moments of display of power for the local guests. Isabella circulated where he indicated, talked with whom he suggested, and avoided the sidebar for long enough that it seemed there was no reason to avoid it. But there was a moment when Rodrigo called her back to the main group with an impatience he did not completely disguise, and when she replied that she had already finished the conversation with the partner he had suggested, he said in a voice loud enough for the nearest group, "You took too long again. I need you to pay attention when I indicate something." The observation fell into silence differently from the previous ones. Perhaps because there were more people around, perhaps because the tone had been a little louder than it used to be. Isabella felt the eyes of some people look away, with the discomfort of those who witnessed something they shouldn't, and she recognized that feeling inside, the feeling of being exposed not by her own choice, but by someone else's need for control. She replied with a calm that cost more than it seemed, "I am here now. We can continue." Rodrigo looked at her for a second, and then turned to the guests as if nothing had happened. But it had happened, and this time there was a witness who was not just another uncomfortable guest who preferred not to get involved. When the group dispersed briefly, Isabella passed the sidebar with the naturalness of someone getting a drink. Henrique was with his back turned, organizing bottles. She stood for a moment, and he turned without haste, as if he knew it was her. Their eyes met for 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds more information passed between them than any conversation could have transmitted. He had seen. She knew he had seen. He placed a glass of water in front of her and said, with the same calm voice as the previous week, but with a different precision in his eyes, "Is there more to see tonight?" She replied in an equally low voice, "I hope not." And she went toward her husband, who was waiting for her in the center of the room with the expression of someone waiting for something they believe they own. The rest of the night was a succession of small tests that Rodrigo applied, without others around realizing they were tests. An unnecessary request that served to see if she obeyed. A public comment about a detail of the dress he disapproved of, disguised as a joke. A deliberate interruption when she began to answer a question from one of the guests, taking over the answer in the middle of her sentence. Each of these gestures, in isolation, could be interpreted in various ways. Together they formed a pattern she knew by heart. Henrique was watching each one of them, and Isabella, for the first time in a long time, was not alone in that room. But being accompanied did not make that night any easier. In fact, there was something even harder about being observed by someone she loved, while enduring what she endured. Isabella felt this when, near midnight, Rodrigo called her for a photo with the investors and positioned his arm around her shoulders with a pressure that looked like a hug to those looking from the outside and was an instruction to the one feeling it from the inside. "Smile more," he whispered while the photographer adjusted the angle. She smiled, the camera clicked, and in that instant, with the white flash on her face and Rodrigo's arm weighing on her shoulders, Isabella made a decision. It wasn't a noisy or desperate decision. It was that type of decision that doesn't need words, because it is already whole before being formulated. It was the decision of someone who spends a long time carrying something and finally realizes they no longer need to carry it. She didn't yet know exactly how that week would end, but she knew it would end differently from all the others. On the other side of the room, behind the marble counter, Enrique Fonseca folded the napkin he had used to clean his hands and placed it on the counter with the precision of someone who keeps every detail he saw that night. He had arrived there seeking confirmation of what he suspected. He had found much more than he expected, and much less than he expected to endure seeing. The following week would belong to him. She slept little that night. Rodrigo fell asleep shortly after they arrived home, as he always did after nights of representation, exhausted by the effort of being admired for hours on end. Isabella lay with her eyes open, listening to his regular breathing and thinking that there was something almost surreal about sleeping beside someone who was no more familiar to her than a stranger well-trained to occupy a space. 7 years had passed. She had passed along with them. Enrique Fonseca had not slept much better than his sister. He was in the apartment he kept when he needed to be in São Paulo, on a high floor of a building in Itaim, with the view of the city stretching in all directions like an illuminated map. He was a man of precise habits, and one of those habits was not leaving for the morning what he had seen at night. When he arrived, he turned on the computer, opened the files he had begun to prepare weeks before, and worked for hours. What he had built over the months was not just fraternal concern, although it was also that. It was a methodical, silent investigation conducted with the same rigor he applied to any risk analysis in his business. When he first suspected that his sister's situation was more serious than she let on in the occasional conversations they had, he didn't call immediately to ask. He observed, gathered information, talked to people who moved in the same environment, and gradually built a picture that disturbed him not only because of what it revealed about Rodrigo, but because of what it revealed about how much Isabella had isolated herself to protect her own marriage from the judgment of others. There were, beyond what he had witnessed personally in the 2 dinners, a series of financial irregularities that had caught the attention of an accountant associated with one of the investment funds Enrique worked with. Nothing documented definitively yet, but patterns that, to experienced eyes, suggested that Cavalcanti and Associados operated in gray areas that went beyond normal competitive market aggressiveness. Rodrigo had built an impressive name on a foundation whose pillars, seen up close, showed cracks, but Enrique was not a financial investigator, and he did not intend to act like one. What he intended was to ensure that when the separation came, and he had decided it would come, Isabella would be protected in every sense, legally, financially, and in terms of public narrative, because he knew the world they lived in well enough to know that Rodrigo would try to control the narrative with the same veracity with which he controlled everything else. That morning he met with Daniel Sartori, Isabella's lawyer, in a discreet room in an office on Faria Lima. Daniel brought the documents he had prepared. Enrique brought his. They worked for 3 hours, and at the end there was a plan that needed only Isabella's signature to be activated. The signature that had been waiting for 6 months had still not arrived, and Enrique understood why. Isabella was a woman who processed things deeply before acting, and there was a part of her that still carried the residual hope that something would change without her needing to completely destroy what she had built. It was a hope he recognized as human and at the same time as dangerous for her. That afternoon, Enrique's phone received a message from a contact within the Fasano Club itself, someone who had worked with him years before in a different context and who now held a position in the establishment's management. The message was brief. Another event this Friday. Mr. Cavalcante reserved the private room. Guest list includes names from the holdings board. Henrique read the message twice, then called Isabella. She answered on the third ring, with that slightly compressed voice he had learned to recognize as her voice when she was in the apartment and could not speak openly. He said only, "Friday. Do you know?" She said yes. Rodrigo had mentioned the previous night as another work event she should attend, this time smaller, more intimate, only the closest partners and associates, the type of dinner where his control over her would be even more visible because there were fewer people and less distance between everyone. Henrique said, "I will be there." She wanted to say it wasn't necessary, but the words didn't come out. Instead, she was silent for a moment and then said, "Be careful." He replied, "Always." When she hung up the phone, Isabella stood by the window of the office in Villa Olympia for a long moment, looking at the city below with that specific feeling of being on a threshold. This side was everything that had been built in years of containment, adaptation, and strategic silence. The other side was unknown, but there was something in it she had stopped feeling for a long time. The possibility of being entirely herself. That afternoon she signed the documents Daniel had prepared. Not on impulse nor with anger, but with the serenity of someone who made a decision after having exhausted all reasons not to make it. Daniel looked at her when she returned the pen, and she noticed in his eyes a discreet mixture of relief and professional respect. He said the process could be started whenever she wanted. She said, "After Friday." Daniel did not ask why. He just took note. In the 2 days that separated that afternoon from Friday, Isabella lived in parallel. Externally, she was the wife Rodrigo knew, present at the indicated appointments, responding to messages at the right time, arriving home before him. Internally, there was a cold and serene precision she recognized as the state in which she functioned best, that state she had built 12 years of business with, that state people around rarely associated with her because they saw her only as someone's wife. When Friday arrived, she dressed alone, without waiting for him to choose the earrings. She chose hers, the ones she had put back in the box 6 days earlier, the amethyst earrings that were her mother's, which her mother had worn the night she met her father, which carried a history that belonged to her and not to him. She put them on slowly, looked at herself in the mirror and saw with a sharpness that cost years that the woman in the reflection was the same one who had existed before the marriage, before the restrictions and the gradual moldings, just more tired, but whole. Rodrigo arrived from the office and found her ready. He looked at the earrings, and for a second it seemed he was going to comment, but something in her face, some different quality in the expression she had not exhibited before, made him say nothing. He just grabbed his jacket and said it was time to go. In the taxi that took them to the club, they were in silence. It was a different silence from the previous ones. Rodrigo checked his phone. Isabella looked out the window at the lights of São Paulo passing like brushstrokes of a city that continued its life indifferent to what was about to happen in a private dining room in Jardins. And she thought that there is a type of courage that makes no noise, that does not announce itself, that simply arrives at the right time and does what needs to be done. She was that courage. The city passed through the taxi window with the speed of someone who stops for no one, and Isabella recorded every detail of that journey with an attention that was not anxious but archival. The lamppost on the corner of Brigadeiro, the closed bakery with the orange awning, the student waiting for the bus with the heavy backpack on his shoulders. There was an entire life happening out there that knew nothing of what she was carrying, and in that ignorance there was something that liberated her slightly. Not every pain needs an audience to be real. Rodrigo got out first, as he always did, and entered without waiting for her to get out. Isabella got out slowly, looked at the club's facade for a second, and walked toward the door. The club's private room was smaller than the main hall, but no less imposing. An elongated table for 16 people, illuminated by a crystal chandelier that projected prisms of light onto the white tablecloth and the porcelain dishes. The walls were lined with dark wood, and there was a built-in bar in the corner, discreetly served by 2 employees. The window looked out onto the club's internal garden, where amber lights illuminated the perfectly trimmed bushes. The guests were 12 in total, all men with the exception of Isabella, and 2 other women who accompanied their husbands for the same purpose she was there. The names Rodrigo had mentioned, partners and board members of Cavalcante and Associados, circulated the room with the confidence of those in the right territory. There was among them a group complicity Isabella had observed before, the complicity of people who benefit mutually, and who, therefore, have a collective interest in keeping appearances functioning. Rodrigo was in an excellent mood, which Isabella recognized as a sign that there was something he wanted to achieve that night. He was most charming when he needed something, and most cruel when he thought he already had everything guaranteed. Good humor was usually the construction phase before the collection phase. Henrique was behind the built-in bar, with the same discreet uniform and the same posture he had perfected over weeks of observation. No one had questioned his presence because he had taken care of every detail, so there would be no reason for questioning. Isabella saw him when she entered the room and gave no sign. She just went to her place at the table and sat down. The dinner began with the usual cadence. Dishes arrived, wines were served, conversations crossed about the market, about economic policy, about names of projects that carried significant figures in the subtexts. Rodrigo conducted the table with skill, giving space to each one at the right time, pulling back the reins when the conversation went in a direction that did not interest him. He was a maestro of social situations when he wanted to be, and that night he wanted to be very much. At one point, one of the oldest partners, Osvaldo Pereira, asked Isabella directly for her opinion regarding a real estate valuation index that had been a topic of recent discussion. It was a genuine question, not instrumentalized. Isabella began to answer with the analysis she had recently done regarding the same index for an internal report of Fonseca Participações, a well-founded analysis involving data that most people at the table did not usually cross-reference. She had spoken for approximately 40 seconds when Rodrigo interrupted her with a rehearsed lightness, took over her reasoning, concluded it in a more simplified way, and received the nods around as if the idea were his. Osvaldo looked briefly at Isabella, with a discomfort imperceptible to anyone not paying attention. She smiled and lowered her eyes to her plate. From the bar, Henrique saw everything. The night followed. Around 10:30, with the dinner concluded, and the conversation migrated to drinks and smaller groups, Rodrigo went to the bathroom, and Isabella stood near the garden window. Osvaldo approached and said, in a low voice and with a tone that carried more than surface politeness, "You were right, you know. The correlation index you were citing is exactly the point no one wants to discuss openly." Isabella looked at him with genuine surprise. "Thank you," she said. Osvaldo nodded slightly and moved away before Rodrigo returned. It was in this sequence that the night took the turn Isabella had feared and at the same time felt as inevitable. Rodrigo returned from the bathroom with something different in his expression, a tension she recognized as the tension of someone who received unwanted information. She learned later that one of the partners had commented innocently that Isabella had made an interesting observation about the real estate index before Rodrigo took over the subject. It wasn't an attack, it was just a comment. But for Rodrigo, any recognition directed at his wife that didn't pass through him first sounded like a threat. He came toward her with the apparent calm that preceded his most controlled explosions, those that happened in a low voice, and in a register only she could completely decode. He said they needed to talk, used his arm to guide her slightly to a more remote corner, and there, with his back to the other guests, said she had embarrassed the table by trying to demonstrate knowledge in a context where she had not been requested. Isabella looked at him. She said she had been requested, specifically by Osvaldo. Rodrigo said the invitation had been out of politeness, not real interest. He said she should know the difference. He said for years he had asked her to understand the role she occupied in those environments, and that she continued to resist it. Isabella was silent for a moment. Then she said, with a voice that came out firmer than she had planned, "The role you defined for me." The silence between them was short but absolute. Rodrigo looked at her with an expression she knew and had always learned to treat as a signal that she should back down. But this time she did not back down. She said, "I've heard enough tonight, Rodrigo. I want to leave." And the night, which until then had followed the usual script with only variations in intensity, began to spiral out of control in a way that neither of them had completely foreseen. Rodrigo did not lower his voice immediately. He had intoxicated his ego throughout the night with the compliments of the partners, with the dinner that had gone well, with the sensation of being the center of that private universe. And now the limit was being pushed from a side he did not expect. The wife who had said directly and without the habitual strategic softening that she wanted to leave represented a break in the script he had not approved. "You will leave because I will leave," he said, more as a declaration of ownership than as a proposal. Isabella said she could call a car herself, and there was something in that so simple declaration, the declaration that she was capable of leaving alone, that hit him as if she had said something much greater. Because she had said something much greater. She had said she didn't need him to leave there, and that was, in that marriage, a heresy. The other guests in the room began to realize there was something happening in the corner, not by shouting, because there was no shouting yet, but by the quality of the silence between the two, which was different from the comfortable silence between couples. There were those who looked away and those who pretended not to see, the habitual repertoire of those who witness something they don't know how to name. And on the other side of the room, behind the built-in bar, Enrique Fonseca was seeing everything. He had placed the discreet tablet he had been carrying in his apron pocket for a week, verified the angle of the room's security cameras with the manager who owed him the favor, and confirmed that the angles covered the area near the window where the two were. He had done this with the coldness of someone who plans, not because they want the worst, but because they know the worst has been happening for too long, and the only difference this time is that there will be a record. Isabella tried to move away from Rodrigo, taking a step toward the center of the room. He followed her, and when she didn't stop, he grabbed her arm with a firmness that was not a request. It was a command, and this time it was visible to 3 people around who looked away with the reflex of those who know what they are seeing, and yet prefer not to be seeing it. Isabella stood still. She looked at his hand on her arm. Then she looked at him, and she said for the first time in 7 years, without lowering her voice so only he would hear, "Let me go." The room went silent. The silence that fell over the private room at that moment had a particular quality, the type of silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something no one wants to name out loud. Conversations died. Drinks stayed suspended halfway to the mouth. Every person in the room was looking at something else, but no one was seeing something else. Everyone was seeing what was happening in that corner near the garden window. Rodrigo did not let go of the arm immediately. There was in him in that second the visible battle between the instinct for control and the calculation that there were too many people in the room. But instinct won, as it always won when there was enough alcohol and ego. He pulled her arm toward him with a force that was not disguisable, and said, with the voice that had risen a register above what any confidence bears, "You will stay here until I say we can go." Isabella pulled her arm back with a force that surprised him, and she said no, 1 word, 1 syllable. 7 years compressed into a negative that no longer had anything of deference. It was then that Rodrigo, for the first time in front of his partners and associates, lost his veneer completely. He didn't scream, because there was a part of him still functional enough not to scream, but he said, with a cruel clarity and without any disguise of civility, "You are my wife, you do what I say. It has always been like this, and it will continue to be." Osvaldo Pereira backed away slightly. 2 of the women in the background exchanged a look. The younger partner, Marcelo, placed his glass on the table with excessive care, as if he were afraid of making noise. And it was at that moment that Enrique Fonseca came out from behind the bar. He walked with the same calm precision with which he had done everything over the last weeks, without haste, without theatricality, only with the determination of someone who reached the end of a waiting period and is acting in the moment he had chosen. He stopped at a reasonable distance from Rodrigo, enough to be heard by the whole room without needing to raise his voice. He said, "Don't touch her." Rodrigo turned with the expression of someone who was interrupted by someone who had no right to do so. He looked at the bartender uniform, then at the face, and said, with a contempt that bordered on the laughable, "Do you know who you are talking to?" Enrique replied, "I know exactly who I am talking to. The relevant question is whether you know who you are talking to with me." There was a pause. Rodrigo opened his mouth to say something that certainly would have been a threat. dismissal, the use of influence, the professional destruction he believed he had the power to apply to anyone who dared cross his path. But before he spoke, Enrique took the tablet from his apron pocket and placed it on the nearest table, turning the screen toward those present. The recording began to play. They were the images from the room's security cameras. 3 different angles, all covering the area near the window. The grip on Isabella's arm was visible. The force with which he had pulled was visible. Her expression was visible. And the words, "You are my wife, you do what I say," were being reproduced with a sharpness that left no room for alternative interpretation. Rodrigo stood motionless. The partners and guests in the room looked at the screen. Some approached. Osvaldo Pereira stood up with an expression that had passed from discomfort to something closer to contained indignation. Marcelo was clearly disturbed. The 2 women who before had exchanged a look now looked at Isabella with an expression she recognized as the recognition of someone who has seen something like this before, perhaps in a mirror. Then Henrique said, still with the same calm, "My name is Henrique Fonseca. I am the CEO of Fonseca Digital Ventures, and I am the brother of Isabella Fonseca, the woman this man has been treating as property before you for years. I have been here this week and last week to see with my own eyes what was reported to me. I saw more than I expected." The name Fonseca Digital Ventures had the effect Henrique knew it would have. It was a name people in that room knew. It was a name that meant billions in assets, investments in strategic sectors on 3 continents, a presence in the market that rivaled anything Rodrigo had built and surpassed most. The equation of the room changed completely in real time before the eyes of everyone. Rodrigo tried to speak. He said there was a misunderstanding, that the images didn't show the full context, that a private conversation was being taken out of proportion. They were the phrases men with power use when they are exposed, built on the assumption that context favors whoever controls the narrative. But the context was on the screen, and the faces around were no longer favoring anyone in that room except the woman who had said no, with a voice that now the whole room had heard. Isabella looked at her brother for a moment. There was in that look an entire conversation that didn't need words. Then she looked at Rodrigo and said with a calm that wasn't cold but was definitive, "This is the last night I spend in the same place as you. The documents will be delivered tomorrow morning." And she left the room. Henrique stayed. He put away the tablet. He looked at Rodrigo for a second without anger, just with the expression of someone recording what they are seeing so as not to forget. And then he turned to Osvaldo Pereira, who had approached, and said in a low voice, "If you are interested in talking about the holdings projects in a different context, I am available." Osvaldo nodded, and in that nod was the beginning of the collapse of what Rodrigo had built. Outside the club, Isabella waited for the car she had called while still inside the private room, even before leaving. São Paulo followed its life with the usual indifference, the night traffic, the lights of the buildings, the passers-by who didn't know that a woman was standing on the sidewalk of a club in Jardins, after having said no for the first time in 7 years. When the car arrived, she got in. The driver asked if everything was all right. She said yes and realized it was true. She was well in a different way than she had been for a long time. It wasn't the well of someone who feels nothing. It was the well of someone who felt everything, endured everything, and finally chose to remove herself from the place where she had stayed still for too long. As the car followed along Avenida Paulista, she opened her phone and sent a message to Henrique. "Thank you." He replied in seconds with a single word, "Always." And below, after an instant, "Are you okay?" She replied, "I am being myself. I think it's been a while since I was." He didn't respond with words. He sent just a heart emoji. Henrique Fonseca, tycoon of 3 continents, sending an emoji to his sister in a car in the early hours of São Paulo. There was something in that made her smile for the first time in many hours, in a way that wasn't serving any purpose other than the smile itself. And that, she realized, was already enough to begin. In the days that followed that Friday, São Paulo continued with its habitual speed. Indifferent to the fact that a marriage had ended in a private room of a club in Jardins, and that the effects of that termination began to branch out in directions that neither Rodrigo nor Isabella had completely foreseen. The documents Daniel Sartori had prepared over 6 months were delivered on Saturday morning as Isabella had said. Rodrigo was not in the apartment when they arrived, which was at once a relief and a complication. His lawyer received the papers and sent a text message to Rodrigo that, according to Daniel, took almost 3 hours to be answered. When he did answer, the response was a protocol negative that none of the lawyers took seriously as a sustainable position. Isabella spent the weekend in the apartment Henrique had reserved for her in a building in Pinheiros, discreet and comfortable, far from Avenida Europa and everything that belonged to the universe she had inhabited for 7 years. She slept more in the first 2 nights than she had slept in weeks. It was the sleep of someone who let go of a weight they had carried for so long they had forgotten what the body felt like without it. Henrique stopped by there on Sunday with coffee and cheese bread. The two stayed on the balcony for hours, talking about things that weren't the process, weren't Rodrigo, weren't the documents. They talked about his company in Lisbon that was growing beyond expectations, about a photography exhibition she wanted to see at MASP, about the memory of their mother, who had left when Isabella was 22, and whom Henrique said sometimes she had inherited the analytical capacity and effective stubbornness from in the exact same proportion. Isabella laughed at that with a laugh that came from the true place of laughs, not from the performative place. It was a sound she almost didn't recognize in herself. On Monday, when she entered the office in Villa Olympia for the first time after that Friday, the team received her with the professional normality that had always characterized that environment. No one there completely knew the details of the marriage, but everyone knew in some way that work environments transmit without words that something had changed in the posture of the CEO who arrived that morning. There was in her a more direct presence, an occupation of space that didn't have the habitual compression. It was the same Isabella Fonseca they had always known at work, just without the layer of containment that she now realized she had brought to the office for years without even noticing. The staff meeting that morning was one of the most productive the team would remember. Isabella presented 3 initiatives she had stopped proposing in previous months because Rodrigo had somehow, even if indirectly, created in her the suspicion that expanding her own professional visibility would create domestic problems. The suspension of this invisible brake had a flavor she couldn't completely describe, but which was unmistakable. On Rodrigo's side, the days ran less smoothly. The presence of Henrique Fonseca in that private room, the revelation of his identity before the partners, and the conversation he had had with Osvaldo Pereira at the end of the night produced an effect that multiplied over the following days. Osvaldo had called 2 other board members. One of them had accessed the public records of Fonseca Digital Ventures and verified what had been said. Another had asked questions to a legal advisor, who by useful coincidence was the same one who had raised months ago the financial irregularities that had come to Henrique's knowledge. It wasn't an immediate collapse. It was the beginning of an audit. Rodrigo spent those days trying to control the narrative with the skill that had always been his primary instrument. He called partners, scheduled meetings, prepared versions of events that redistributed the roles in a way more favorable to him. There was a part of him that still believed he could fix what had happened because he had always fixed things. He had always found the right angle, the right argument, the right person to convince. But this time there were variables that were not on his control map. There were cameras that had recorded. There was a brother who was a billionaire and who had been in the room. There was a wife who had said no in a voice that the entire room had heard. And there was, above all, the simple fact that what was documented was real. It had happened, and no alternative narrative erased the memory of those who had been present. Osvaldo Pereira requested a meeting with Rodrigo on Wednesday, and at the end of it, communicated that he would suspend his participation in the infrastructure fund while the internal issues of the holding were not resolved. It was corporate language for something simpler. Trust had been shaken, and without trust money does not move. Rodrigo left the meeting with Osvaldo and stood in the corridor for a few seconds looking at his phone without opening any messages. There was the beginning of an understanding he still resisted completing. The understanding that he had built 7 years of marriage on the control of a woman who possessed more substance, more resources, and more dignity than he had ever bothered to know, and that by losing her he had not just lost a decorative wife. He had lost the only person who had endured his most brutal version for a long enough time that he could delude himself into thinking he was invincible. That illusion was ending. And on the other side of the city, Isabella Fonseca closed a meeting about a strategic acquisition she had postponed for months, signed the documents with the pen she had received from her mother, and looked out the 12th floor window at São Paulo, which pulsed below without stopping. There was a type of freedom that didn't come from the outside, that didn't need validation, an audience, or the recognition of others. That was just the return to herself after a detour that was too long. She had returned. That same week, Renata Montero called her for that coffee she had proposed on the night of the first dinner. They met on a Tuesday afternoon at a cafe on Rua Lorena, in a quiet corner with natural light and no television noise. Renata arrived without the formality of the context in which they had met, in jeans and a light blouse, with the same direct warmth Isabella had noted from the beginning. They talked for almost 2 hours. Renata wasn't the type of person who pretended not to know anything when she knew something, and she knew in a vague but sufficient way that something serious had happened that Friday in the private room. Isabella didn't go into details, but she also didn't shy away from the subject abruptly. She said only that she had made a decision she should have made sooner, and that she was well. Renata listened to her without offering unsolicited opinions, without the excess of performative solidarity that is sometimes heavier than indifference. When Isabella finished, she said only, "Sometimes the most courageous thing is not the one that makes noise. It's the one you do when you finally decide that you matter more than the narrative they built for you." Isabella stood looking at her for a second. Then she said, "Where were you 7 years ago?" The two laughed, and in that laugh was the beginning of something both recognized as real. Fabio Montero had indeed distanced himself from Rodrigo after the events of Friday, not with drama, but with the practicality of a man who evaluates professional risks coldly. There was no more talk about the board. There was only the silent distancing that the market practices when someone stops being a safe asset. Rodrigo would know with time that he had lost more than a marriage. He had lost the narrative he had built about himself, the narrative of the man who had everything, who controlled everything, who had built an empire with his own hands. That narrative now had visible cracks, and cracks do not close just because someone wishes them to close. The separation process followed its course with the efficiency that months of preparation guaranteed. The agreement was concluded with a relative speed for the standards of the type of assets involved. Isabella received what was hers without a prolonged battle, because she had documented, planned and chosen the moment with the precision she applied to everything that truly mattered. And when she signed the last document, she didn't feel triumph. She felt closure, which is something completely different and much more useful for moving forward. 3 months later, on a January afternoon with that humid heat that São Paulo accumulates in summer, as if it were saving it to collect later, Isabella Fonseca went to MASP for the exhibition she had mentioned to Enrique on that Sunday morning, with cheese bread on the balcony. She went alone on purpose, with that specific freedom of going alone to a place she had always wanted to see and that she had never prioritized, because there were other things to prioritize that were not hers. The exhibition was about Brazilian documentary photography, images of places and people captured in moments when the camera catches something the subject does not know is being revealed. Isabella circulated the space calmly, stopping before each image for as long as she wanted, without needing to adjust her pace to anyone's. There was one photograph in particular that held her for a longer time. It was a woman from behind, looking out a window, and the light coming through the window illuminated the slightly revealed profile. The caption said only, "São Paulo, 1987. Isabella looked at that unknown woman for a long time and thought that there was something universal in that position. The woman before the window, the light coming from outside, the silent decision about what to do with it. In the apartment in Pinheiros that had become her apartment, there were flowers she herself had chosen, in the color she had always liked, and that Rodrigo had once described as too dull for environments of representation. There were books piled around the living room without decorative organization. There was a coffee maker that made coffee the way she liked it, strong and without adding anything. There was silence of the good kind. Henrique had returned to Lisbon but called every week. Renata Montero had become a real friendship, That type of friendship that starts by chance and grows because there is something genuine on both sides. Daniel Sartori had closed the process and sent a brief message that said only, "It was an honor to work for someone who knows what they want." Rodrigo had lost two of the holding's main partners and was in the middle of a restructuring that analysts described as necessary. There was no total ruin because he was skillful enough not to sink completely, but there was a perceptible loss of altitude for those who followed the market. Osvaldo Pereira had migrated part of the resources to a new fund in partnership with Fonseca Digital Ventures, which in market language was a clear declaration of preference. On the afternoon she left MASP, Isabella walked along Avenida Paulista, with the lightness of someone who is neither arriving nor departing, just existing in the present of a city that vibrates incessantly, and that, in its grandiose indifference, paradoxically offers a type of freedom to those who have learned not to need its approval. She stopped at a newsstand, bought a magazine she probably wouldn't read completely, and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, simply present. São Paulo passed around her with the usual noise, and in the middle of that noise, silently, Isabella Fonseca occupied the entire space that had always been hers, without asking permission, without waiting for approval, without apologizing for existing completely, as it always should have been. If this story touched something in you, if you recognized in Isabella the strength that exists in every person who finally decides to be themselves, then you are already part of this journey with us. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell so you don't miss any of the stories we prepare with care for you. Leave a like if this narrative stayed with you after it ended, and tell us in the comments, what was the moment of the story that marked you the most? Your voice matters, and it is what shows us that we are on the right path. See you in the next story. End of story.